Chapter 28. The Metamorphosis of Women. The goddess would inaugurate the metamorphosis and deconstruction of women. The masculine goddess. It came from her own nature. Though some of her qualities were linked to femininity, especially in the sexual realm, other traditional feminine qualities were missing, particularly that linked to nurturing, empathy, gentleness, compassion. They seemed foreign to her. She was not a caregiver, and there was almost nothing maternal about her. Her temperament was in many ways more characterized by attributes commonly associated with masculinity. She was a fighter. She was assertive, aggressive, dominant, combative, competitive, courageous, fierce, strong, independent, violent, brave, and ferocious. And it was her nature and power to make others into her image, and thus to turn a woman into a man. The masculinization of women. So we would expect then that as the spirit of Ishtar took hold of American and Western culture, there would begin a transformation of women, a morphing of their identities, functioning, and nature. And that is exactly what happened. The goddess would seek to de-feminize women, to masculinize them, to share in her nature. To do that, she would have to destroy or weaken the male-female paradigm. She would have to separate women from men and man from woman. Ishtar is the workplace. Ishtar has been referred to as an independent woman due to the fact that in the end she was never bound to anyone, man, and as one associated with prostitution, she was economically self-supporting. So at the same time the sexual revolution was taking hold, there was a growing movement calling for women to become like Ishtar, economically independent of men. Millions of women left their homes to join the workforce. The decline of marriage only furthered the trend. Divorce had increased the number of women without husbands, many of them single mothers. They now had to replace the functions of the missing husbands and take on the traditionally male roles of provider and protector. Women were increasingly told to seek meaning and fulfillment not in marriage or motherhood or family, but in the workforce. Transformed into her image. But function and role affect identity and even nature. The identity and nature of women began changing. Women were encouraged and instructed to become aggressive, competitive, dominant, and fierce. Girls were now trained from early childhood to reject typically feminine pursuits. They were bombarded with messages about girl power and fierceness, just as the goddess was fierce and powerful. As Ishtar took on masculine roles and characteristics, so women were impelled to do likewise to assume traditional masculine functions, work attributes, and roles. The new zeitgeist of spirit of the age belonged to Ishtar, and it was causing women step by step to be transformed into her image. Rage of the goddess. Ishtar was bent on breaking conventions. She eschewed traditionally feminine roles and instead competed with men, fighting with them, defying them, and dominating them. So at the same time, the spirit of Ishtar was setting in motion the sexual revolution. Another movement was birthed, feminism, or second-wave feminism. It would be infused from its beginning with the spirit of the goddess. It would thus also set out to break societal conventions, wage war against the concept of femininity, and defy male authority. As Ishtar was given to rage, so a spirit of rage against men became prevalent in American and Western culture, especially within the ranks of radical feminism. Against the patriarchy, the god Anu was the chief deity of the Mesopotamian pantheon. He was Ishtar's father. Ishtar would typically challenge his authority and seek to overrule it. The Latin word for father is pater. From pater we get the word patriarchy, or the ruling fathers. So the spirit of Ishtar, indwelling radical feminism, set itself against what it called the patriarchy. The patriarchy had to be defied and overthrown. Rise of the warrior women. But not only was Ishtar combative, she was a warrior. The Sumerian poem Inanna and Ebi describes the goddess in her ferocity, and she enters into battle. Goddess of the fearsome divine powers, clad in terror, riding on the great divine powers Inanna, Ishtar, drenched in blood, rushing around in great battles. You destroy mighty lands with arrow and strengthen our power lands. Thus, as the spirit of Ishtar began taking hold of American and Western culture, women now began taking on the identities and roles of fighters and warriors. The spirit of the military goddess was manifest in the militarization of women. It was what had been written in ancient times of the goddess's powers and acts. As is inscribed on the ancient tablets, she was at work to put spindles into the hands of men and to give weapons to the women. So the warrior women became part of popular culture and entertainment, where physical combat had once been the domain of men. Women were now increasingly depicted in fiction as bearing supernatural powers to war and wreak destruction. It was all in keeping with the mythology of the ancient warrior goddess. The militarized goddess. Ishtar entered into the battlefield, fully armored and weaponed. It was in her nature, skill and power to wage war. She was a militarized goddess. So upon her return, not only would she revive the image, fantasy, and narrative of the warrior goddess, she would bring about the militarization of women. In other words, the warrior woman would manifest as well in real life. It was a phenomenon that was largely unprecedented for most of human history, the entering of women into military combat. The precedent, though, could be found in mythology. The goddess myths were now becoming reality. It was another manifestation of women being conformed into the goddess's image, and it was also another step in the divorcing of man and woman, male and female. The more women could resemble men or replicate their functions, the less they would need them. Women were now to be their own protectors and defenders, and so these too would feed into the goddess's destruction of marriage. The bond that held men and women together was progressively deteriorating. Womb Ishtar deprived. It was no accident that marriage and family was being continually devalued, the workplace continually glorified, and sexual promiscuity or any sexuality devoid of marriage continually celebrated, having been indoctrinated into the cult of self and self-fulfillment. Both men and women were now more reluctant to enter into marriage and less able to maintain it. Both women and men were now more likely to end up alone. So an ancient Mesopotamian text speaks of the women, whom Ishtar deprived of husbands. Ishtar had promised the liberation of women, and yet studies into the state of women's well-being revealed that since the beginning of the transformation, they had instead grown progressively unhappier. They were now less likely to be married, more likely to be in the workforce, less likely to be fulfilled, and more likely to be alone. And yet even in this day, and yet even in this they had been unwittingly conformed to the image of the goddess. The goddess would not stop with women if she was going to transform cultures, nations, and civilizations. She would have to transform men as well. We now move to her other spell and the other transformation she began, the metamorphosis of man.